So how successful was stage 4 lockdown in New Zealand compared to the less stringent measures applied in most of Australia? Let's take a look. We'll start by losing Victoria for a moment, which was a victim of government incompetence and was therefore an outlier. And we'll look instead at Australia, where stage 3 lockdowns applied. 6 months on, stage 4 New Zealand has chalked up 359 infections per million people. In Australia, in stage 3 Australia, the number is 358. In New Zealand, there have been 4.8 deaths per million. In stage 3 Australia, there have been 4.6 deaths per million. So roughly equal on the health front, but very different on the economic front. Joining me from Wellington to discuss the cost of the enforced lockdown is Oliver Hartwich, Director of the New Zealand Initiative. Oliver, on those figures, does it appear that the New Zealand health measures were a little bit harsh?
Well, I think they were in some ways unnecessarily harsh, especially if you're talking about the level 4 lockdown we had in March and April. The problem with New Zealand was actually that we took an approach that never took into account whether anything was safe to do. We banned it regardless. And I think that was the major difference between Australia and New Zealand over the first few months of lockdown, that we simply banned a lot of activities that were perfectly possible still to happen in Australia. And consequently, I think our economic downturn will be a lot worse than in Australia.
Now, in justifying those lockdowns, Jacinda Ardern went to the worst case scenario, the worst case health scenario. Based on that, I think it's fair enough for us to talk about the worst case economic scenario. What is the worst case economic scenario for New Zealand?
Well, we will get our quarterly GDP figures for the second quarter on Thursday this week. And what we expect is probably a correction of 16%. So that is, I think, more than twice as bad as what we had in Australia. So the economic figures will be pretty disastrous. We also know that our debt to GDP ratio will go up, according to Treasury forecasts, to about 53% by 2023. So we're looking at a public debt catastrophe really for New Zealand. But actually, more longer term, we have two industries in New Zealand that are particularly hard hit by the crisis. And one of them is, of course, tourism, because the border is closed. You can't get into New Zealand unless you're traveling on a New Zealand passport or you hold a New Zealand resident visa. And the other industry is, of course, education. So we have also blocked access to international students, and they, of course, just as in Australia, paid a lot of money into our university system, but also into our secondary schools. So these sectors are unlikely to recover, not this year, perhaps not even next year. And so I think the New Zealand economy will take a long time until it gets back to pre-COVID levels. I've just seen a forecast from Westpac, and they say that basically it will take until about 2022, 2023, until we reach GDP activity levels that we'd last seen late 2019.
And let's talk about the dire fiscal position of New Zealand. They've actually started printing money big time, right? Quantitative easing, in essence.
They have, and the RBNZ is basically doing what every other central bank around the world is now doing. They have started moving towards quantitative easing. They've currently allowed themselves up to 100 billion New Zealand dollars of quantitative easing, which is quite a lot of money in a small economy of just 5 million people. So it's about a third of our GDP that the RBNZ is prepared to print under quantitative easing. We are not in negative interest rate territory just yet. The RBNZ said that they would actually hold the official rate until March next year. But from April onwards, I think we can expect slightly negative interest rates from the RBNZ. And actually, we've had our first negative interest rate on New Zealand government debt just last week in an auction of government debt. For the first time actually in history, New Zealand debt actually recorded negative interest rates.
Now, New Zealand, of course, went for eradication rather than just trying to control the spread and achieved it briefly, it seemed, for a period. But now it's back, right? I mean, how much of that return do you think can be blamed on the government not checking its borders, and how much of it is just, the natural infectiousness of this particular virus?
To be fair, it's probably a bit of both. I think that it was always optimistic to think that we could achieve and maintain elimination in New Zealand. but we certainly couldn't have achieved it with the kind of border management that this government has demonstrated. So we had a number of stories that may not have been reported in Australia, which actually demonstrated quite nicely what was wrong with our border management. The most interesting case was probably a trip taken by two sisters from Auckland to Wellington. They had just arrived from London to be with a dying parent. Now the parent died and they tried to get to Wellington to be with a grieving mother. Now, they were let out of managed isolation in Auckland without having a COVID test. They were given a car and said, well, you can drive down to Wellington. And when you get there, can you please get tested? And of course, they drove down to Wellington all the way from Auckland, got tested and were positive. And the public didn't really understand how that was possible. How could the Ministry of Health actually allow that to happen? At the very least, they could have had a test before they were given the car to drive down to Wellington. But that was a story that we didn't quite understand. The other thing that we didn't understand was why the Ministry of Health was at some stage even organizing children's parties, birthday parties in managed isolation for children from different flights at different stages of isolation. We then found out that more than 60% of the workers at our border and in managed isolation facilities never had a single COVID test. So really the government showed a remarkable degree of incompetence of managing the border. So it was just a matter of time probably until the virus escaped, and it did in mid-August when we had the first 4 cases again in Auckland, which led to yet another lockdown for Auckland and put the whole country on a higher alert level.
Now, the Ardern lockdown required a lot of coercion, didn't it? I mean, in fact, she called herself the enforcer, famously, in that early press conference. This seems to be a characteristic of centre-left governments around the world. I mean, Victoria, we've got this heavy enforcement. We see the same pattern in California, where it's a heavily enforced compulsion to wear masks and various things. And now in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon from the Scottish Nationalist Party, left-leaning party, they're doing the same, even though they've got relatively few cases compared to, say, England. What is this about the left, Oliver? Why is it that they always want to go for this, thump you down sort of approach?
I'm not sure whether I follow that analysis completely. I don't think it's a left-right thing, at least not entirely. Look at what's happening in Britain with Boris Johnson now limiting it to meetings of maximum 6 people. Look at what's happening in Israel. And I think Netanyahu wasn't really always known as a left-winger either. So I think it is not a left-right question. It's just that governments like to be in control, and some governments actually develop an appetite for control. What I would say about the New Zealand government was that it was not a question of whether they were left or right-wing. They were just incompetent at organizing some aspects of it. And not just the border management, by the way. Just to take a completely different aspect, take the legality of the lockdown. One thing that really shocked me was that the first 9 days of the level 4 lockdown in New Zealand were actually declared unlawful by our High Court. So we suspected at the time that the government didn't actually do this properly. There may have been a public health justification, but you still have to actually follow the rules, and you have to play by the rule of law to introduce the lockdown properly, and they didn't do that. And we heard at the time from the police and through leaked documents that actually Crown Law advised against doing it in the way the government did. The Attorney General then said, no, nothing to see here, move on, but still changed the basis for the lockdown regardless 9 days later. Now the whole thing was taken to the High Court, and the High Court declared it was unlawful, and the government shouldn't have done it that way. And tellingly, the public actually doesn't take any notice of that, because they're basically letting them get away with murder, well, the legal equivalent of murder, because they think that, they have saved our lives and that's good enough, and who cares about the rule of law? But I think it's dangerous because it sets a precedent for future government action. And actually, once the government becomes so used to actually being able to do whatever it wants to do, without taking into account any kind of cost-benefit analysis or rule of law concerns or anything else, it is becoming a very dangerous precedent for future government action.
One thing that's been striking in this is how badly wrong the initial modelling was. And Jacinda Ardern, when she brought the lockdown in, talked about incredible numbers of New Zealanders who would die without the lockdown. Now, that seems to have been way overblown. Why have governments so slow to adjust to the new reality, and that is that it's a pernicious virus? It infects just about anybody it gets close to, but in terms of death, it's limited to the elderly and the infirm, as we know, and that if you take proper precautions around nursing homes and other things, you can keep the death toll down to an extent that's no more than an average flu. Why do governments struggle to adjust to the risk factor, which is reduced now?
Well, I suspect that none of us really knew back in February, March, how deadly this virus was going to be. So we had to rely on some experts. We had to rely on some modeling coming out of epidemiological departments at leading universities. We had no other chance but to rely on these experts. What's happened since, I think, is that governments may have realized that the initial forecasts were wrong. They were way too pessimistic, and they never really materialized these horror numbers we heard in February and March. But what has set in is a certain path dependence. It becomes very difficult for governments to correct themselves and actually say, well, we probably went a little bit overboard in March and April, because that actually requires an admission of actually having gotten it wrong. And governments don't like doing that. So that is a problem. The other problem is actually, there were, of course, a few, mainly economists back then, who said, well, actually, even though it might be a deadly virus, but what you're doing actually doesn't stand any chance under normal cost-benefit considerations. And I remember that we at the initiative here in Wellington, we produced a study led by Dr. Bryce Wilkinson in early April, where we said, well, even under your worst case scenario, which we got from the Ministry of Health at the time, it might be worth spending up to 6-point-something% of GDP on this if we just take a normal kind of value of a statistical life. But we could already see back then that it was way more expensive than 6% of GDP. So we had some doubts. We actually put this on paper and we published this back then. Everything that has happened since demonstrates that this initial skepticism, this economic skepticism based on conventional cost-benefit analysis, was correct. But it is telling that the government in New Zealand, and I believe in Australia so far, they haven't actually produced anything looking like a normal cost-benefit analysis, because they can probably already assume that the results wouldn't look flattering for them.
Yeah, let's go back 6 years. I'd just taken over at the Menzies Research Centre, and I approached you to write a monograph, The Quiet Achievers, the New Zealand Path to Reform, and what was happening then under the John Key being English government was a real inspiration to us here in terms of what reform you could introduce. If I was to ask you to do a follow-up to that now, I suspect it would have a very different tone to it.
It would, and in hindsight, I'm not even sure whether I should have written that essay, because it praised the Key government, well, the Key English government really, for its first couple of terms, when they actually introduced some welfare reforms, when they were fiscally responsible. And I said, well, they were achieving all of this in a very kind of sober way. They were not really engaging in grand rhetoric. They were just getting on with the job, and they were reforming it as they went along. The problem was that I think my essay gave them cover not to do anything in the third term. So the third term was a wasted time really for the country, because National actually stopped the reforms and took the quiet achievers a bit too literally. In any case, the essay I would write today would, of course, sound completely different, because we had a change of government. That government actually presented itself as transformational when they started, but actually, seriously speaking, they haven't really achieved much in the last 3 years. They promised a lot. They were fantastic on public relations, on announcements, but they haven't actually been able to achieve anything in policy terms. So this government shows a remarkable discrepancy between communications and PR and actual achievement and evaluation on the other hand.
Well, thank you, Oliver. We've had conversations behind the scenes about the economic situation in New Zealand and here in New Zealand. It's something we always appreciate your perspective on. I'm sure we'll be asking you to join us again before long. Thank you very much for joining us on Water Cooler.
Thank you, Nick. Goodbye.